Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Traumatology, The Many Faces of Trauma series. This series aims to be an insightful educational content created in collaboration with the members at the Calgary Therapy Institute, as well as Mount Royal University. I'd like to give a special thanks to Ian and Ella and Angelica for helping with this series. Whether you are listening to this series through podcast or watching the video content on YouTube, it delves into the multifaceted and complex nature of trauma. In this series, we cover topics from developmental trauma to attachment to the neuroscience of trauma and many other topics in between. I'm glad you could join us as we delve into the realm of education, expert wisdom, and practical approaches, where hopefully you can embark on your own individual journey to form your own understanding on what trauma means to you and how we can cultivate healing and resilience for our loved ones, for ourselves, or people in our community. My name is Rebecca. I am a graduate student with a background in developmental, cognitive, and brain sciences, and now in counseling psychology. And I have a curiosity about the impacts and complexity of trauma work and healing. I'm joined with my colleague, Dr. Patricia Miller, who will be providing the expert wealth of knowledge, experience, and expertise in trauma for this series. Welcome, Dr. Miller.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Dr. Patricia Miller is a registered clinical psychologist and registered clinical social worker with a PhD in behavioral social sciences and soon to be a PsyD in clinical psychology, and has been working in the field for almost 25 years. At the beginning of her studies, she did a Bachelor of Social Work, Master's in Counseling Psychology, and another in Social Work. Dr. Miller has been a professor in child and youth studies and social work for the last 12 years, teaching about human development, interpersonal violence across the lifespan, counseling skills, among other courses at the university level. As an active researcher, Dr. Miller has published numerous peer-reviewed research articles, book chapters, and textbook publications, primarily in the areas of interpersonal violence, trauma, and community-based research practices. Over the years, she's specialized in working alongside individuals with complex mental health and trauma across the lifespan. She is now a proud owner of a private practice clinic in Calgary called the Calgary Therapy Institute, as well as a private practice clinic in Victoria. Here, she provides therapy assessments, education, and consultation. But additionally, she does act as a director of research and clinical development. That's a mouthful, Dr. Miller. Thanks for committing your time to sharing your knowledge in a way that's really accessible for our viewers, students, and just anyone who's curious to learn more.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm looking forward to this series. This is like legacy work. I get to take all of this great opportunity, all of the knowledge, all of the experiences with humility and, sort of that vulnerability of knowing this is important information, and I want to be able to bring it back, into society, into the professions, into just general knowledge for people to be able to take and use in a good way, right? To make meaning out of it. And, this becomes now a part of sort of a next phase of work where I'll also be doing some writing. I have some book material I'll be writing around prevalence and the space of silence around the burden and hope healing and the role of self-determination. So this continues over the next few years, and this piece is really important to me because it is an opportunity to provide, right, and to gift it out to students. It'll be used in classrooms, it can be used in any trainings, it can be used just for people interested for their own healing or those that they might love and care about. And so I hope that it can be, brought forward in a way that's very meaningful and very sensitive to this topic and the burden that people can live with, but also the hope and healing and what that can mean as we go forward during some very complex times. So I really look forward to this opportunity. I thank you so much for entering in on this journey and all the people that have, already been supporting the development of this work and the information that will be in it, and to all the people whose lives that I have had the honor of being a part of and continue to do so. I also acknowledge them because it very much has shaped out the work I have done, has shaped out what I can be thinking about and be educating about, and just the honor, right, of seeing that resiliency in the human spirit. So I also bring that up and acknowledge it as we move forward with the series.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Miller. For our first episode, we will be discussing how we can begin to define trauma, if we can even define it, and just really gauging and understanding to really set us up for our future episodes.
Great. Thank you. I look forward to that.
To begin, I'd like to kind of understand what your working framework for how you understand trauma is. So, of course, there's no universal definition for what trauma means. Based on your professional experience and practice, and as we heard, the 25 years of experience that you carry, how do you conceptualize trauma when you go into your workspace?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's just lots of dialogue out there around what is a true, pure definition of trauma. And I think the good news is isn't really one that we say blankets for everyone. But really what I've looked at and lots of people talk about is that trauma is the lived experience that comes from a traumatic incident or incidences where someone in their ordinary life experiences something extraordinary that takes away their right to be safe, to have to control, to be in some sort of situation where they know they're okay, they're no longer okay, and something is happening to them. And then on the other side of that is the lived experience, what the impact is, how it impacts them psychologically, physically, the neurobiological responses that change and they now live within, the ways that their life changes, the burden of suffering they live with. So trauma encompasses many components of lived experience that is post some sort of traumatic experience or experiences. And this can be multiple across the lifespan, so it's not necessarily a one-of, but it could be a one-of. And so again, you go back into trauma and you think about the lived experience that comes in around when the ordinary of your life, something extraordinary comes in and takes away your right to be safe, to have control, to be known in what you need so you can be safe and have control. And it has some sort of impact that changes who you are and changes how you live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think you pointed to this narrative around trauma to be what is it that happened to you. Mm-hmm. The book, What Happened to You by Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Bruce Perry talks a lot about how there's a really important change of the narrative within trauma work from what's wrong with you, we need to fix this about you, versus what happened to you and how can we start to kind of uncover the layers behind a traumatic experience that has happened to an individual and why that might be dysregulating them and how.
Mm-hmm. And that becomes a really important part of the responses that we choose to help those that have been impacted by something traumatic to heal as they live with trauma, and how we can bring forward this idea of even reaching in with safe, healthy relationships that honor that person and their story, seeking to understand what happened to them versus why are you doing that? Why do you keep doing that? Mm-hmm. Right? Which really is a judgment around something that they may be, showing, exhibiting a behavior or a lack of engaging or over engaging in something, and that judgment and shame that can go into, well, why do you keep doing that? I thought you said you're going to stop doing that, versus tell me what happened to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When we talk about the different traumas that you see coming through your door, what's the variety that we're kind of speaking to here?
Well, the list is long. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you can look at, in my practice and in the practice over the years that I've been a part of, I mean, it can be everything from early on childhood abuse that might not get talked about till later in life because people haven't been safe, they're burdened with shame, they've tried to talk about it, they haven't been heard. So you'll see earlier in life child abuse, again, that's talked about later in life, or sometimes it's brought in by a family member, that loved one is also brought in to seek immediate care. And of course, there's lots of appropriate responses that we have to take to keep that person safe. Anything from, there could be bullying, there could be abuse in interpersonal relationships. That can be partner to partner, it can be family members. You can look at, there can be workplace traumatic experiences around, could be a workplace injury of a colleague. I work within doing work around Veterans Affairs and those that have been, in war, have been impacted, whether out on tour, professionals that live with a vicarious impact of work they're doing on behalf of society, to people that are impacted by some of our natural disasters, fires, floods, things that happen, in the larger community and world in relation to things that are happening around natural disasters, community violence, online violence. I mean, the list probably is so many pieces. We'd spend most of our time talking about all the traumatic experiences that people can go through. And every year there seems to be something a little bit different, a little bit more intense, or it's compounding based on some of the complexities we have happening in our larger world and just the ways that people are being, are experiencing not only violence in their communities, but violence around the world. And other natural disasters that shape out society, and that people are being exposed to in different ways. And also, you can also recognize that sometimes it's people that come in being exposed to a traumatic experience that a loved one went through, and that can also deeply impact them, or loss. There can be a lot of experiences around traumatic loss, sudden medical crisis. There's all sorts of things that can be happening in people's lives. And again, those traumatic experiences begin to impact the person that experienced them or the person that loved the person that experienced them.
So there's a real compounding effect, like you mentioned.
Yes.
And you're right, the list is very long, and we could probably do dozens and dozens of episodes around every type of kind of traumatic experience that people live, because everyone has a very unique lived experience.
Right.
But we will be doing an episode specifically about the multifaceted nature about trauma, where we can talk about the compounding nature. But that makes sense in terms of explaining the breadth and variety of trauma that walks through your door. When it comes to defining trauma and differentiating it from stress, I think a lot of the times these concepts can have kind of a blurred line because there's a lot of overlap between the two, especially considering that stress is not the same as trauma, but trauma is often stressful. How can you kind of speak to the differences and similarities and how those two interact?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, stress within itself is something that we function within every day, most people, most adults, and not just adults, but children and youth. In many ways, we're wired to deal with a certain amount of stress. We do have a sympathetic system that kicks in. It gives us a little jolt of cortisol to get us moving a little faster to deal with. We can rise into stress and be very resilient and work ourselves through that, i.e., just maybe a baseline example is you might be caught in traffic, you need to get to someplace on time, you feel very stressed, you can feel yourself feeling overwhelmed. It's just like you stay focused on, okay, I can't get out of this traffic situation. I'm gonna breathe, sing a song, talk to a friend on hands-free, of course, and just try and get through it. Now, a traumatic experience is more than just stress, but stressfulness within it is there because something begins to happen and it takes away our right to be in control, to feel safe, to feel that we are in a situation that we can somehow get through without something bad impacting us or someone close to us as well. And i.e., that could, if you take it back to the traffic situation, that could be something to do with a traffic accident that happens in quite a significant way, and there could be then some sort of injury, and that also could mean psychological injury, that something so significant in such a harmful way has changed how we experience ourselves physically and psychologically in relation to driving, being able to function. And so we have then an impact that continues to impact us as we live forward from that accident, i.e. we might have nightmares of the traffic incident, we might have less ability to be able to drive on the road and not have panic attacks, we might avoid driving, we may not be able to work, play, do the things we normally would do because of the traumatic impact that we now call living with trauma.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing is the impact of the experience is very dependent on the level of stress or trauma that's being experienced. So you spoke a bit to how we're catered, our systems, our nervous systems are catered to be able to live functionally with stress. So there's a level of positive stress we can endure, and that can help us to kind of adapt and create new coping skills. And then there's tolerable stress, where with the proper supports, there's a tolerable amount of stress that we can endure. Mm-hmm. And there's toxic stress, of course, which is for a prolonged period of time can have really dysregulating and negative impacts on the body and mental health. When we talk about trauma, how do those levels look? Because there's kind of acute and complex, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it depends. There's lots of things that you have to factor in. So you're looking at, the person themselves. And some of the research does suggest that if you've had any previous traumatic events and impact, then anything moving forward can further compound that. So when you're thinking about acute, so acuity means something that's very severe, very significant. It's so intense, it takes us beyond what would be a normal threshold for stress in our day-to-day life, right? So if you think about, if we are living in the city and we are fairly safe, on most days we walk around feeling safe. If we took ourselves, there's incidences of, high conflict countries, there's a different level of stress, right, and traumatic impact. So some people may be able to tolerate more of that type of traumatic impact based on they've lived in more of it. So when you start looking at how, what is the impact and acuity, I sometimes say, okay, you got to look at what's the baseline for the people that you're working with. And some people do have a higher level of day-to-day stress that they can cope and deal with. But when you take it into acuity, it usually means around life-threatening, takes away your locus of control, where you're in a situation and you have no control to be able to stop it, to be able to deal with it with the internal and external resources that you have. So then somehow you're caught in an impact of something happening that you can't take control of. And that's when the nervous system, will do the work to cope as best as it can, but it can only cope to the threshold that it could in relation to what is your normal and your capacity to deal with that normal. So anything that comes in abnormal, you shift from acuity to chronic. So chronic can be living within a situation and where the impact, so the traumatic impact continues to show up. And that could be daily, weekly, etc. Sometimes this happens in interpersonal relationships where there's a certain level of abuse. And so someone might be exposed to a lot of psychological, physical, could be even sexual abuse, where it's chronic. It's happening more often. So they don't get the recovery. Because some of the research says within about 24 to 48 hours, depending on acuity, the brain and body will recover. It'll start to come out of some of that more significant stress response, where your sympathetic system has you so fully engaged to fight, flight, freeze. But it, depending on the backside of that, of what's happened, the severity of it, if you are able to come through it, then you start to do some recovering, which means you start to sleep better. You feel you can eat now. You feel less nervous. If it's chronic, it means you don't get to recover. It's like, next day there's another incident. So now you're in a heightened state of stress response and you never really come out of it. And so that compounding of chronic can have significant longer term impact. And then complex, we use that language to say, usually it's multiple traumatic experiences across the lifespan. Could start in childhood. experiencing some sort of childhood abuse. It could be within family, community, and then you'll see potentially some interpersonal violence within relationships in, let's say, early adulthood. Could be some significant harassment in the workplace, a lot of, let's say, psychological abuse where people aren't safe emotionally to be in the workplace. And you'll see this compounding effect, and people aren't recovering. So then you see more of a burden in suffering, and they're not able to live a quality of life like they would like to, or even like they're capable to, which means they might stay home more. They're not as engaged in things that they enjoy. They may have longer absences of not being at work, dropping out of education. You'll see sort of this correlation around parts of their life where it's almost like they miss chunks of good living because of the impact of traumatic experiences that compound the complex version and living with trauma, that burden of living with trauma.
It sounds like even if trauma isn't labeled as complex, there's a lot of layers and complexity to the concept of trauma itself, whether it is acute or it's chronic or labeled as complex. So there's a lot of factors, like you mentioned. It can be internal. It can be about what's the threshold, what's the window of tolerance an individual has to combat this stress or traumatic experience. What is in this individual's environment that helps them to cope with a traumatic experience? Also, the severity of the event itself is also, there's a lot of kind of key players too that you would need to kind of address when you're working with someone in the clinic. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. And really being mindful, it's not a one session. Here, let's talk about your trauma. When people are working or are coming in with more of a complex trauma profile, it means you need to take time to begin to understand and explore what happened to them, because it can go back as far as into childhood, and then you'll see it in other developmental stages of their life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when we talk about doing that trauma work, the research points to the therapeutic alliance being one of the most important things. And like you mentioned, you don't just sit down and start to talk about what happened to them. It is a process over time.
Yes, and if they're not safe in the helping relationship, which means you're not really interested in understanding them, and to make sure they're safe in that understanding, it's like another violation. They're invalidated. They may have talked about something they're feeling very vulnerable about, and it wasn't valued for what it was. And then they feel the judgment and shame that can get internalized and further hurt and harm.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about kind of the intentionality of the series is to clarify and undo some of that harm that exists around the concept of trauma, what do you think are some of the kind of common or harmful stereotypes or kind of sentiments that are circulating in society around the concept of trauma that hopefully this series or just education around trauma can help to dismantle?
Well, I think there's a lot of stereotypes and biases out there around who should, be able to talk about trauma and who shouldn't. And, historically, like when you look at traumatic experiences and really what was recognized and where the diagnosis of PTSD came from, you are looking at war-related trauma that first got identified as being, something significant, and that PTSD began to, be developed as a diagnosis more from the medical profession. And you also saw it then start to link into some of the family violence and actually around battered women and children. You saw that movement as well, being able to recognize some of that impact. But when you think about living with trauma, I think the important piece is that any person that is living with some sort of trauma that reaches out and begins a conversation to say that, I'm feeling burdened, I'm not doing well, I'm afraid, I don't know how to talk about that. The door should be open, the relationship built to create that safety, to seek to understand. And some of our stereotypes are very gender influenced, who should be able to talk about things, who should be able to cry, who should be able to be vulnerable. And that really leaves out large population groups that, feel they shouldn't have these feelings, or something must be wrong with them, that they couldn't just get over this. And I think a lot of society has genderized who should be able to experience or talk about trauma and who shouldn't. And that has kept a lot of people from healing. And I see that a lot in my work, of the shame that builds in around, let's say for a male-identified person, that I should be just able to get through this. Like, why am I feeling these feelings? Why do I want to cry about this? And it's because you've been impacted by something significant. And those are natural emotions to feel in the impact.
And I think what you're saying about kind of giving the psycho education around what is the impact, what happened to you, can help give people the language that can actually express what it is that they've been going through, whether it's from childhood or it's something that's happened in more recent experiences. Helping to give people the language about, this is a traumatic experience that I'm coping with and learning how to manage, can be really helpful as well.
Yes, and I think in relation to that as well, you think about our helping professionals in the world, like first responders, people that serve our country. A lot of times there's a burden in doing work that is to protect others, that they feel they shouldn't be impacted in that work. Like, this is just called work, get over it, get on with it. And there can be quite a bit of stigma and discrimination within certain institutions that have, professions or professionals that are serving our country, our provinces, our cities, etc. And so opening the door for those conversations is really important, that you are impacted by traumatic experiences through the work you do. And it's important to be able to talk about that so you can go back out there and do the work you love to do. Or it might change how you do the work that you do because you've been impacted by something so significant. So not to forget those that are also working in the fields of serving our cities, our provinces, our countries, plus the professionals that are also doing this work and constantly exposed to those stories of traumatic experiences that people are going through. Because the exposure itself can leave a lasting impact, and then professionals are living with trauma and also feeling afraid to talk about it because of stigma and discrimination, and professionals should just know how to deal with that. And a lot of the research is saying for helping professionals, you're seeing numbers like 60, 70, 80% of helping professionals that are doing care around people's traumatic experiences are living with some sort of psychological burden and possibly not talking about it.
I think part of what this series aims to do too is to open some of those doors and open up a safe, comfortable, judgment-free space for those conversations to happen as well.
Because if we can take it from, oh, what's wrong with you, into what happened to me, that becomes a space where people can see an impact. And because of the impact, it's changed them. Because in a lot of the impact, they didn't ask for that to happen to them. It happened to them. And then they live with it thinking, what's wrong with me that I couldn't cope with that? And that's where the burden further compounds into the shame and the silencing of carrying, the impact of living with trauma and not feeling like you deserve help, to even begin to talk about wanting help because you feel so ashamed of the person you are.
And I think we'll be talking a lot about that in future episodes, is understanding and doing psychoeducation around what's the emotional responses that come from this, what's the responses in the brain, the stress response that come from this, what are the interpersonal impacts of the trauma, and shedding some more light on this isn't the individual's fault, this is happening to them because of something that happened, something traumatic that happened to them. So I think that should help to provide some insight, hopefully, to viewers and even just people who are interested to learn more about trauma as well.
Yeah, and that is the goal. Education is one of the most crucial components of helping, because when people can begin to understand the impact, they don't internalize it as what's wrong with me, which further can bring in that hopelessness, helplessness, despair, and shame. When we know there's been an impact, when we begin to understand that the impact has changed who we are, the biology, the psychology, the way we behave in the world, we begin to see potentially some hope, some knowing that there are ways, with the help of good professionals and programs and responses that we can bring in society, that there can be a way to work through this and to have a better quality of life and to see it as something that happened to me and now I'm learning how to live with it.
that there's hope.
Hope. Yeah, that's
Thank
a big
you,
one.
Dr. Miller. And thank you all for listening. Dr. Miller, do you have any last thoughts for the listeners?
I'm just looking forward to being able to continue to speak to you about this topic, this broader topic, and all the different components we've thought about, and, knowing the benefit of all work that is done in this area, and that education can be, a key for people getting help and for those that are helping to help in a more trauma-focused way.
That's great. Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Miller.